Join today to take your SAT prep to the next level. Members get access to over 1,000 solution videos answering the questions in College Board's question bank and concept based practice questions with videos to solidify your SAT skills. Thanks for watching. Grateful. Now let's start with question 1. Here we have a vocab question where we're looking for the vocab word that will fill this space. And for these, you want to invent your own word to fill the space before you look at the answer choices. So let's go ahead and start reading so we can do that. These people stress that biodiversity loss due to invasive species is blank. For example, people can take simple steps, such as washing their footwear after travel, to avoid introducing invasive organisms into new environments. So, based on that purple sentence, in my own words, I'm going to say biodiversity loss due to invasive species is easy to prevent, because the example that was given is that all you have to do is take some simple steps in order to keep it from happening. So, looking at the answer choices, preventable, that's perfect. Undeniable, we're not talking about how it can't be denied, or we're not talking about how common it is, or how worrying it is. And I think the lesson on a lot of these is to make sure to read that extra information because it's there to point you in the right direction as far as what word to choose. But the answer here is A. Going to question 2 now. This is a vocab question. It's asking us for the word that will fill the space. And for vocab questions, you want to invent your own word to fill the space before you look at the answer choices. So let's start reading to be able to do that. It's by no means blank to recognize the influence of this painter on this other painter's paintings. Indeed, one of the guys cited the other guys as an inspiration. However, scholars have suggested that the ancient poem that's being mentioned here may have had a far greater impact on the work. So let's take this apart. In this part right here, we're seeing support to the idea that that connection that was mentioned in the first sentence was a really obvious connection. So based on that green part there, what we're seeing is that Bosch had a huge influence on Ali's paintings. Indeed, Ali himself cited Bosch as an inspiration. So what we're looking for right here is the idea that Bosch had a huge impact, that it makes a ton of sense to recognize the influence of Bosch on Ali's work. So now dealing with the double negative part of it, it's by no means wrong, because if we're seeing that Bosch did have a huge impact on Ali, so saying it in the positive would be Bosch had this giant impact. Saying it in sort of the double negative is it's not a wrong thing to say that Bosch had this influence on Ali. So we're talking about a very big presence of double negatives on the SAT and how you really need to kind of take your time and piece those apart. You know, you have a little bit more time on the SAT than other types of tests, like the older SAT or the ACT. And, you know, it's never enough time on a standardized test. You never have quite enough time for everything you want to do, but you do need to know where to slow down and sort of be really systematic to avoid little mistakes. So if we're looking for wrong, looking at the answer choices, substantial means meaningful, satisfying is not the same as wrong. Unimportant, that's going to end up being the answer. We don't love it, but we don't hate it. And appropriate means right. So maybe you can think of appropriate, satisfying, and substantial all as right. And so the closest one, and the one we'll end up picking, is C, because it's saying it's by no means the wrong thing, or it's by no means a bad thing or an unimportant thing. So just the fact that it's negative is kind of what makes it the answer. So the answer here is C. Going over to question 3 now, we're being asked about the function of the second sentence in the structure. And when you have a question about the underlying portion, what you really need is the overall main idea. The underlying portion is simply important in how it interacts with that main idea. So think of these as main idea questions. And let's start reading. Astronomers are confident that this star will consume all its helium and explode. They're less confident, however, about when that'll happen because it depends on a lot of more complicated stuff. This team recently investigated the acoustic waves, whether that could be used to determine what we need to know, but they concluded that this method could not sufficiently reveal the internal characteristics. So, just reviewing, we know the star is going to explode. We don't know when. This team did a study, but they concluded that the study wasn't really giving them the information they wanted. So let's start looking at the answers. Before we do that, let's just reiterate the underlying portion. The underlying portion was kind of telling us what they were unsure of, where their uncertainty was, because they knew it was going to explode. They didn't know when. So it was the uncertainty, and it was kind of the setup, because this uncertainty is what they tried to investigate in their study, even though it didn't work out. So let's go ahead and look at the answers. The underlying portion describes a serious limitation of the method, not a limit of the method. It's kind of what they wanted to know. B presents the central finding. Well, it wasn't the finding, it was more of the mystery of what they didn't know. C identifies the problem that they attempted to solve but did not. That's perfect because it has everything we need. They attempted to solve it and they did not solve it. And D explains how their work was received by others. Definitely not. It was just saying, this is what we want to know more about. So the answer here is C. Now we're going over to question 4. This is asking us about the function of the third sentence, the underlined portion. And when you have questions about the underlined portion, what you really need is the overall main idea. The underlined portion is important in the way that it interacts with that main idea. So these are main idea questions. So let's get that main idea. This tree evolved in East Asia where a beetle preys on its seeds. In 1785, the trees were introduced to North America, far away from that beetle. But evolutionary links between predators and prey can persist across centuries and continents. 2001, the beetle was introduced in southeastern North America. Within a year, 93% of the trees had been attacked by the beetles. So, reiterating the main idea, we have this tree that has been preyed on by a beetle. Then the tree was introduced really far away from any of those beetles, but there's only so much you can do. These links persist across centuries and continents. Finally, around 2001, a process started that resulted in the trees being attacked by those same beetles. So it's kind of the idea that you can't escape certain things that are kind of naturally linked to each other. And the purple sentence is the one that says that. It says, even though they took the trees away, the links persist. You can only get so far. So maybe describing the heavy connection between predators and prey, between this tree and the beetles. So let's look at the answer choices. A, it states the hypothesis that they set out to investigate. There wasn't really an effort to investigate this. They're describing something that happened kind of accidentally. B, presents a generalization that's exemplified by the discussion of the trees. That is the generalization, and the red part is the furthering of the discussion. So that makes a lot of sense. C provides a context that clarifies. A context would be like a time or a place. So, you'd have to understand we were talking about the Civil War. And so that's the context. And so now whatever story I'm saying would make more sense. So we're not getting a context in purple here. And D, it offers an alternative explanation. Well, ask yourself, what would that sound like? One reason for this is reason A. Another possible alternative explanation for this is reason B. And the purple sentence here was doing nothing of that sort. So the answer here is B. Going over to question 5 now. We always start with the prompt on every question where there is a prompt. And here it's asking us, how would text 2 respond to text 1? So we need to be a little sure of what text 1 is saying, so we can then ask ourselves, what does text 2 think about that? So what's text 1 talking about? When companies in the same industry propose merging with one another, they often claim that the merger will benefit consumers by increasing efficiency and lowering prices. This economist investigated this notion in the context of the US newspaper market. She modeled a merger of Minneapolis area newspapers and found that subscription prices would rise following a merger. So there was the question about whether or not mergers are going to benefit consumers. And someone did an experiment and arrived at the result that subscription prices would probably rise. So, in other words, the merger will not benefit consumers. And what does Text 2 think about that? These economists have argued that research on the effect of mergers have focused excessively on short-term effects, which tend to be adverse for consumers. Using the case of consumer banking in Italy, they show that over the long term, several years, the efficiency gains realized by merged companies do result in economic benefits for consumers. So, what would Text 2 say about the idea that mergers are going to hurt consumers? They would say that that idea is focusing too much on the short term effects, whereas the long term economic benefits are actually worth considering instead. So we're looking for an answer that says that text 2 thinks that text 1 is too short-sighted. So looking at the answers now, A, text 2 would recommend that they compare the near-term effects with the effect of a merger in another newspaper market. I don't think it's about different markets. I think it's about long-term versus short-term. B, they'd argue that over the long term, the expenses incurred by the newspaper company will also increase. So there was the focus on long term, but it was actually saying it would be a bad thing over the long term. The expenses would increase. So it kind of sounded right for a second there. C, they would encourage fan to investigate whether the projected effect persists over an extended period. So that's the idea that maybe it's not a bad thing over the long term. So that's probably the right answer. D, they would claim that mergers have a different effect on consumer prices in the newspaper industry than most other industries. That may or may not be right, but it wasn't what Text 2 said. Text 2 said they need to look at the long term where there may be positive effects. So the answer here is C. Going over to question 6 now. What is true about Eleanor? So that's our prompt. That's where we always want to look first. And let's start reading. So this text is from a novel. Eleanor lives with her younger sisters and her mother, Mrs. Dashwood. Eleanor, the eldest daughter, whose advice was so effectual, possessed a strength of understanding, coolness of judgment, which qualified her, though 19, to be the counselor of her mother, and enabled her to counteract, to the advantage of them all, the eagerness of mind in Mrs. Dashwood, which must generally have led to imprudence. Imprudence is kind of unwise behavior. She had an excellent heart. Her disposition was affectionate, and her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. It was a knowledge which her mother had yet to learn, and which one of her sisters had resolved never to be taught. So we're hearing about Eleanor, who was the oldest daughter, and she had great advice. She had strong understanding, cool judgment, and that qualified her at such a young age to give her mother advice. And she even counteracted her mom's eagerness of mind that led to bad behaviors or bad judgments. She had a great heart. She was affectionate, strong feelings, but she knew how to control them. And that control of her feelings was something that the mother had yet to learn. And one of the sisters was so rebellious that she could never do it. She resolved she would never learn that. So we're just talking about how awesome Eleanor, the eldest daughter, was. And let's go ahead and look at the answers now. What is true about Eleanor? She often argues with her mother, but fails to change her mind. I don't think it's that one. She can be overly sensitive with regard to family matters. No, for A and B, we're looking for examples of Eleanor just being amazing in every way, like it's being described here. And C, she thinks her mother is a bad role model. They didn't say that Eleanor had a bad opinion about her mother, and she's remarkably mature for her age. That makes total sense because she was even counseling her own mom. So she was just so ahead of her age, and everyone depended on her. And she even gave advice to her own mom. So the answer here is D. Going over to question 7 now. Based on the text, what is true about the person's acquaintances? And let's start reading. So the text is coming from a certain novel. She was a woman of strong individuality whose comments upon her acquaintances, present or absent, were marked by a frankness, at times no less than startling. This characteristic caused her to be more or less avoided. She was aware of this sentiment on the part of her acquaintances and rather exulted in it. So there's a little bit of vocab here, but the main character had strong individuality. She had comments that were very frank. Frank means very honest. And they were marked by a frankness that was startling. It was no less than startling. And this caused people to avoid her. She was aware that people were avoiding her, and she kind of exulted in it. In other words, she kind of enjoyed it. She kind of wallowed in it a little bit. And so, what is true about her acquaintances? They were annoyed by her comments. She's too open, too honest, and they were avoiding her a bit. So, which answer says that? A, they tried to refrain from discussing topics that would upset her. It wasn't really about her being upset, it was about her being someone who didn't have a filter. A, they're unable to spend as much time with her as she would like. I'll go for that if there's nothing better, because it's not that they have other commitments or anything, it's that they don't like her. So C, they're too preoccupied with their own concerns to speak to her. It wasn't that they were too busy, it was that they didn't like her. And D, they're likely offended by what she has said about them. And at this moment, we kind of see similar value to B and D. But what's the difference? Well, if they're offended by what she said about them, where would we see that in the text? And we do actually see it. Her comments were marked by a frankness, and those were comments that were upon her acquaintances, present or absent. So let's go through that again. She would make comments about people, about people she knew, whether they were there or not. So, in other words, she's a gossiper talking about people who are absent, and they're overly open and honest comments. So, she's talking a lot without a filter about people who are maybe not even there. And so they're offended by what she has said about them. She's a gossiper. And the answer here is D. Now, going to question 8, what is the main idea of the text? So, this is a little bit of Shakespeare, nothing like a little Shakespeare on the SAT. It says the poem is addressed to a close friend as if he were physically present. Weary with toil, I hurry to my bed. The dear repose for limbs with travel tired, but then begins a journey in my head to work my mind when my body's works expired. For then my thoughts, from far where I abide, begin a zealous pilgrimage to thee, and keep my drooping eyelids wide open. So let's take that apart a little. So weary means tired. Toil is hard work. And by the way, if you need some extra help with some of this vocab that's on the SAT, you can go to gratefultestprep.com/practice, click on the vocab tab, and use some of our vocab tools. So, tired with hard work, I hurry to my bed. A repose, like a break, a recovery for my limbs that are very tired. But then laying down, there's a journey in my head. So going off into a dream, there's like a whole journey going on in the dream. It works my mind, even though my body is tired, expired. And at that time, my thoughts go far away. They go on a zealous pilgrimage. Zealous means motivated, inspired. extreme, and pilgrimage is like a religious trip. So my thoughts go off on a spiritual journey, kind of, and they keep my eyelids wide open. So this person is laying down and starts, wants to rest because he or she is tired. But suddenly the thoughts turn into a zealous pilgrimage to thee. In other words, to you. So remember, the poem is being addressed to a close friend. So the person starts taking a journey in his or her mind over to the friend, and that keeps his eyes open. So although he wants to sleep in a way, he's also excited to be imagining visiting the friend. So look at answer choice A now. The speaker is asleep and dreaming about traveling to see the friend. I don't think he's dreaming about traveling. I think he is traveling in his imagination, he or she. B, the speaker is planning an upcoming trip. No, because the trip is metaphorical. C, the speaker is too fatigued to continue a discussion. There was nothing about a discussion that was being cut off. And D, the speaker is thinking about the friend instead of immediately falling asleep. That's perfect because there's a pilgrimage to thee and it's keeping my eyes open. So it wasn't like a dream in terms of being a sleeping dream. It was sort of a daydream because the eyes were open. And so the person is thinking about the friend rather than sleeping. So the answer here is D. Going over to question 9 now. Always read the prompt first. Which finding from the research would support the claim? And what is the claim? So black beans are a nutritionally dense food, but they're difficult to digest, in part because of their high levels of soluble fiber and compounds like raffinose. So these are the two things that make it hard to digest. They also contain anti-nutrients like tannins and trypsin inhibitors, which interfere with the body's ability to extract nutrients from foods. So they also have these guys that cause people to get less nutrition out of their foods. In a research article, these people claim that inducing fermentation of black beans using lactic acid bacteria improves the digestibility of beans and makes them more nutritious. So they're inducing fermentation using a certain bacteria, and that improves digestibility and nutrition. So there are limitations to black beans because of the fiber, the raffinose, the tannins, and the trypsin inhibitors, but causing fermentation using bacteria helps out in that situation. And that's the claim. So let's look at answer choice A. When cooked, the beans contain more trypsin inhibitors and tannins, but less fiber and raffinose. Well, that wouldn't necessarily be good because these things here are being spoken of as bad things. So it wouldn't be, we're not looking for something bad to happen. We're looking for when they're fermented, good things happen. So here we have kind of more of the bad things, but less of these bad things. And so it doesn't make sense. It's kind of splitting the bad things, two of them one way and two of them the other. B, fermented beans contain less soluble fiber and raffinose than non-fermented, so less of the bad stuff. Okay, so far so good. And when cooked, the fermented beans also displayed a reduction in trypsin inhibitors and tannins. So this one is saying that the fermented beans have less of these two bad things, less soluble fiber and raffinose, and that when they get cooked, they end up having less of these two bad things. So in other words, fermented beans are better in every way. Now going to C, when the fermented beans were analyzed, they were found to contain two microorganisms that are theorized to increase the amount of nitrogen absorbed by the gut. This can't be the answer because we don't really know if nitrogen is good or bad, so it's just kind of random. And D, both fermented and non-fermented black beans contain fewer trypsin inhibitors and tannins after being cooked at high pressure. Well, maybe the problem with this is, well, first of all, both fermented and non-fermented. So they're kind of grouping the two in the same category, although the main idea of the passage was that the fermented ones had their own special characteristics, so they were not to be grouped together. So the answer here is B. Join today to take your SAT prep to the next level. Members get access to over 1,000 solution videos answering the questions in College Board's question bank and concept based practice questions with videos to solidify your SAT skills. Thanks for watching. Grateful. Now going over to question 10, which choice effectively uses data from the table to complete the example? So, what is the example and what are they talking about here? Let's start reading. Earth's atmosphere is bombarded by cosmic dust originating from several sources: comets, asteroids, other types of comets, and Oort cloud comets. Some of the dust material vaporizes in the atmosphere in a process called ablation, and the faster the particles move, the higher the rate of ablation. So, what is the ablation? It's the idea of the dust material vaporizing in the atmosphere. And we're seeing the rule. The faster the particles move, the higher the ablation, the higher that they're going to vaporize into our atmosphere. So this team, or this person led a team that calculated the ablation rates for elements in the dust and showed that materials in slower moving SPC or AST dust has a lower rate than the same material in faster moving HTC or OCC dust. For example, okay, so the final thing here is that material in the slower moving SPC AST has a lower ablation rate than the same exact stuff in the faster moving HTC or OCC. So that's the example we're looking to complete here. For example, whereas the average ablation rate for iron from AST was 28%, so we're talking about the iron in one of these groups was 28%. We're going to be looking for the iron in one of these groups to have a higher rate because that's what the main idea said. So the two groups, HTC and OCC, are actually much higher numbers than the ablation in iron in the other two. So we're looking for the iron to be high. So this one has the word iron, but is giving us a low number. And it's talking about the blue ones. We want the red ones. So here they talked about the blue ones, and we're comparing them to the faster moving red ones. So iron from HTC, that fits perfect. That's one of the red ones there. And, or better to circle it in red. And it's accurate to the chart. The ablation from iron from HTC dust, iron, HTC, it is 90. So it fits the comparison that they were saying, and it's accurate according to the graph. So the answer here is C. Going over to question 11 now, which choice effectively uses data from the graph to illustrate the claim? So what is the claim? High levels of public uncertainty about which economic policies a country will adopt can make planning difficult for businesses, but measures of such uncertainty have not tended to be very detailed. Recently, this economist analyzed trends and news reports to derive measures not only for general economic policy uncertainty, but also for uncertainty related to specific areas of economic policy, like tax or trade policy. One revelation of her work is that a general measure may not fully reflect uncertainty about specific areas of policy, as in the case of the UK, where general economic policy uncertainty did what? So a lot of complicated stuff in there. But the point at the end is a little more clear. We're seeing that a general measure may not fully reflect uncertainty about specific areas of policy. Now, looking at the graph, we have the general, which is this box right here, and we have the two specific areas of policy, which are those two. And what we're looking for is the idea that the general may not fully reflect, it may not match the specific ones. And so looking at the graph, where do we see that? Well, right around here, we see the general very high, and trade was below it, and taxes were above it. But right over here, we see the general low, and taxes are about equal, but trade is way higher. And so we see a differing relationship as far as how the general bar matches up with the other two. So the general bar is about this high at every point, and it's not consistently in line with the other two bars, sometimes higher, sometimes lower. So let's see which answer matches that. A says general uncertainty aligned closely with tax and public policy in 2005. Is that true? Well, um, general is close to tax and public policy right there. Those two are about the same height. But it differed from uncertainty about tax and public spending in 2009. Is it differing in 2009 from tax and public spending? No, it's actually right in line. The darkest bar there, which is the general policy, is right in line with the other two. So we found something we don't like about A. The claim at the end was kind of wrong there. Looking at B, general was lower than tax and public spending each year. Was general always lower? In a lot of years it was, but this is a year where it was very clearly higher. So we can't say it was always lower. C, general, let's erase these. General reached its highest level between 2005 and 2010 in the same year that uncertainty about trade and tax and public spending reached their lowest level. So general is at its highest level right here, and tax and public spending is not at its lowest level. So C is just inaccurate. So it's got to be D. Let's see. D says general was lower than trade policy in 2005. So here's general and here's trade. So general is lower than trade in 2005 and higher than trade in 2010. So here, general is right here in 2010 and trade is down there. So those are both right. General is lower than trade in 05 and higher than trade in 2010. So that works. And the answer here is D. Now going over to question 12, which choice describes data from the table that supports the researcher's hypothesis? And let's try to understand a little bit. When hibernating, Alaska marmots and Arctic ground squirrels enter a state called torpor, which minimizes the energy their bodies need to function. Often, a hibernating animal will temporarily come out of torpor, called an arousal episode, and its metabolic rate will rise, burning more of the precious energy the animal needs to survive the winter. Alaska marmots hibernate in groups and therefore burn less energy keeping warm during these episodes than they would if they were alone. A researcher hypothesized that because Arctic ground squirrels hibernate alone, they would likely exhibit longer bouts of torpor and shorter arousal episodes than Alaska marmots. So, what we're seeing here is that the Arctic ground squirrels hibernate alone, which means that they need more help conserving energy because they don't bunch their energy together and conserve body heat in a group like the Alaska marmots. So they're going to have longer bouts of torpor. So they're going to hibernate for longer and save more energy, and shorter arousal episodes. When they wake up, it's going to be quicker because they need to go back to saving their energy. The data seems to back that up absolutely perfectly because the Arctic ground squirrels are in torpor for more time, so they're hibernating, saving energy for longer periods of time. And when they have arousal episodes, the duration of those is shorter. So they're waking up for less time so they don't waste their energy. So the data perfectly backs up what the hypothesis is saying. So let's look at the answers now. A says the Alaska marmots' arousal episodes lasted for days, while the Arctic ground squirrels' arousal episodes lasted for less than a day. Well, the arousal episodes were less than a day for both groups. And so the idea of the Alaska marmots' arousal episodes lasting for days is incorrect, and we can easily get rid of answer choice A. B, the Alaska marmots and the Arctic ground squirrels both maintain torpor for several consecutive days per bout on average. This is a similarity, and the hypothesis was a difference between them, so that's really easy to get rid of. C, the Alaska marmots had shorter torpor bouts and longer arousal episodes. Okay, well, that is what we're seeing. The marmot had the shorter torpor bout, 13.81 compared with 16.77, and
it had longer arousal episodes, 21.2 compared with 14.2. So now this makes a lot of sense because the marmots were the ones that huddled together. It says it right here. They hibernate in groups and therefore burn less energy keeping warm. So they have more collective heat because they're in a big group. So they can save, they don't have to save their energy the same way the Arctic ground squirrel does. So this one right here is not so bad. And D, the Alaska marmots had more torpor bouts than arousal episodes, but their arousal episodes were shorter than their torpor bouts. This is a lot of confusing information, but we don't even really need to get into it because it's not comparing the Alaska marmot to the Arctic ground squirrel. So the answer that we liked is C, and we're picking that for answer for question 12. Going to question 13 now, starting with the prompt like always. Which choice most effectively uses data from the table to complete the statement? And what's the statement? Over the past 200 years, the percentage of the population employed in the agricultural sector has declined in both France and the US, while employment in the service sector, which includes jobs in retail, consulting, real estate, etc., has risen. However, this transition happened at different rates in the two countries. This can be seen most clearly by comparing the employment sector in both countries in which 2 years, because we're seeing pairs of years. So now going back into this, we're seeing that agriculture has declined in France and the US, while employment has risen. However, this is happening at very different rates. So we're looking at the two declines in agriculture from France to US from 1 year to the next, and the two increases in service from 1 year to the next. And we're looking for them to kind of both do the same thing, but at different rates. Very, very tough and difficult question. Now, the pair of years that ends up working is this one right here. Let's take a look. From 1900 to 1950, agriculture is declining 43 to 32 and 41 to 14. So it's more severe in the US. It's a bigger deal in the US. The decline is bigger. And the service sector in that same time is rising, like the paragraph said it would. But once again, it's more severely rising in the US. 28 to 35, that's 7. 31 to 53, that's a bigger number, 22. So 1900 to 1950 are the 2 years where we're seeing, like we said, agriculture declining, employment rising, but at different rates, both more intensely in the US. And the answer here is A. Let's go over to question 14. Let's start with the prompt like always. Which choice most logically completes the text? So let's start reading. Leafy spurge is a plant that has become invasive in North America, where it displaces native vegetation and sickens cattle. It can be controlled with chemical herbicides, but that approach can kill harmless plants nearby. Recent research on introducing engineered DNA into plant species to inhibit their reproduction may offer a path toward exclusively targeting the leafy spurge. Consequently, so we're hearing that there's this invasive plant and it's displacing, so it's kind of overtaking native vegetation and it's sickening cattle. It's possible to control it with herbicides, but that's going to kill nearby plants. And possibly engineered DNA, injecting it into the plant species, may work because it'll exclusively target just that plant. So that may be the solution. So we're imagining this to say that may be the solution. And let's start reading the choices. Making individual plants more susceptible to existing chemical herbicides. Possibly because that would target just those plants, even though I don't like that one necessarily because we already know that the herbicides kill harmless plants nearby. So we've already been told that the herbicides are a bad idea. So we can cross that one out. If we have to, we'll resurrect it later. And B, consequently, so we're finishing this sentence. The research on introducing engineered DNA into the plant species to inhibit their reproduction may offer a path toward exclusively targeting the plant, consequently enhancing the benefit of the leafy spurge. Well, there's no benefit, so we can't enhance the benefit. So we'll get easily rid of B. And so to C, we're inhibiting the reproduction, or we're introducing the DNA to inhibit the reproduction. That may offer a path toward targeting the leafy spurge, enabling the cattle to consume it without becoming sick. Well, if we're targeting it, I don't think it's about kind of making it healthy for cattle. We're talking about getting rid of it. So I doubt that would be the answer. And looking at D, we have this path toward targeting it, reducing the leafy spurge numbers without harming other organisms. That's absolutely perfect, way better than the other answers. And so we're going to go ahead and pick D here. Going to question 15, if we start with the prompt, we can recognize that this is the prompt that we always see before grammar questions. So we're reading for grammar here. Both this person, an Indian American, and this person, an African American, grew up frustrated by the lack of diverse characters in books for young people. In 2011, these two writers joined forces to found Cake Literary, a book packaging company that specializes in the creation and promotion of stories told from diverse perspectives for children and young adults. So we don't really have any need for a comma here. We're hearing that they founded Cake Literary, a book packaging company that specializes in the creation and promotion of these things. So, if we're categorizing the grammar here, this part that I'm underlining in pink here would be considered a modifier. And this part that I'm underlining in blue right now is another modifier. Those are both modifiers. This part right here, that's our independent clause. So the whole sentence is here to tell us that these two writers joined forces to found Cake Literary. And we have two modifiers, two add-ons. One of them says, by the way, this happened in 2011. And the other one says, by the way, Cake Literary is a book packaging company that does a bunch of stuff. Now, just since we're throwing around some of these terms, clauses, and modifiers, you can see that a clause is something with a subject and a verb. John jumped. A dependent clause would have an extra word or something going on that makes it dependent, since John jumped. A modifier is when something's missing the subject, the verb, or both, while jumping. Notice that if you have a modifier, you have to have an independent clause. While jumping, John twisted his ankle. Or a modifier in the middle, John, while jumping, twisted his ankle. Or you could have a modifier at the end, John jumped, twisting his ankle in the process. So you have the clause with the subject and the verb that is the more complete part of a sentence. And then you have the modifier that's usually tacked on at the beginning, middle, or end of the sentence. So coming over here, we've got our modifiers in blue and in red, and we really don't want to disrupt this other one at the end. It's simply a book packaging company that specializes in the creation and promotion of stories told from diverse perspectives for children and young adults. And yes, that's really long, but we see a lot of that on the SAT. We have to tolerate a lot of long worded phrases, and there's no rule that says that a lot of words is a bad thing. So it's not necessarily breaking any grammar rules. So we can go ahead and pick B here. Now going to question 16, let's start with the prompt. And this is our classic grammar prompt that tells us we're dealing with a grammar question. So let's start reading for grammar. In 1930, this artist depicted the natural beauty of this park in two memorable woodcuts. This one here and this one here. In 2019, those exhibits were both exhibited alongside 150 of the person's other works in a single artist show at this museum. So the point here is that we were hearing about two memorable woodcuts. The first one right here and the second one right here. In 2019, both of those were exhibited alongside a bunch of other works. So because we're talking about two works, it has to be B. They were exhibited. Going over to question 17, we'll start with the prompt like always, and we'll see that this is the standard grammar prompt telling us that this is a grammar question. So let's go ahead and read for grammar now. This writer has won acclaim for her short stories, novels, and essays. Now, this is a question about the idea that you have to always read to the end in grammar situations, because at the point that we're at right now, it kind of seems like this is going to continue into the next part. What happens subconsciously for most students is that they'll kind of end right around here and say, okay, well, acclaim for her powerful short stories, novels, and her unflinching depictions. That sounds really good. And so they'll kind of lean toward one of the answers that doesn't have a full stop, like a period or like a semicolon. But if you really do read all the way to the end, you'll really notice that the second part really needs to be its own separate part, praising her lyrical yet unflinching depictions of her native country's turbulent history. This writer has compared her to Nobel Prize winning novelist Toni Morrison. So you see how that second part is its own thing. It really needs to be separated apart. The only answer that's doing that is D here. Going over to question 18 now. Here we see the prompt that alerts us that this is a grammar question. So let's read for grammar. In 1966, this person became the first African American to umpire a Major League Baseball game. His energetic gestures announcing when a player had struck out and his habit of barreling after a hit ball to see if it would land out of bounds transform the traditionally solemn umpire role into a dynamic one. So definitely, before looking at the answers, it seems like there's a lot of continuity going on. His energetic gestures and his habit of barreling after a hit are things that helped transform the traditionally solemn umpire role into a dynamic one. But we don't really need the word that here. It kind of sounded good when I was explaining it, but A is the one that really fits. I'll just read it one more time. His energetic gestures announcing when a player had struck out and his habit of barreling after a hit ball to see if it would land out of bounds helped transform the traditionally solemn umpire role into a dynamic one. Now, a lot of things only work when you go super fast. Surprisingly, our natural speed for understanding things is way quicker than you'd imagine. Just listen to any of your friends talking about their favorite topic. People really speed up and start talking super fast. Sometimes, when we want to understand things better on a test like this, we'll go more slowly because we think that's going to help us kind of make connections and be diligent about it. But going slowly basically stops us from making important connections that we need to make. So you want to go really fast. In this situation, I went fast reading every single word, but you've heard me in many situations achieve that speed by skipping a lot of words. And that's okay too, because you can always go back and make sure that you really got everything you needed. But the point is, you'll do much better quicker than you would if you go slower in a lot of situations like this. And the answer here is A. Join today to take your SAT prep to the next level. Members get access to over 1,000 solution videos answering the questions in College Board's question bank and concept-based practice questions with videos to solidify your SAT skills. Thanks for watching. Grateful. Going over to question 19, we're seeing the standard grammar prompt, so we know this is a grammar question, and let's start reading. In crafting her fantasy fiction, this author has drawn inspiration from the classic 19th century fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. Her 2014 novel, for instance, is a complex retelling of the story of Snow White, while her 2019 novel, Gingerbread, offers a delicious twist on the classic tale of Hansel and Gretel. Now, this question is getting at something really important that comes up a lot on the SAT and on the ACT. There are two primary ways to name things, what we refer to as a long intro, and the other one is the middle modifier. For the long intro, you might hear something like this: SAT instructor Alex Torres is nice. True story, I am pretty nice. But the idea here is that my name is not just Alex Torres. My name is SAT instructor Alex Torres. In other words, for the long intro, the information about a person is combined with the name. So instead of calling someone, Michael Jordan, we'd call him 6-time NBA champion Michael Jordan visited the children's hospital today, something like that. For the middle modifier, on the other hand, a modifier is a piece of a sentence that's missing the subject, the verb, or both. So here, what we have is a subject, but we don't have a verb just in that part. So we're putting the name as some side information, and that's okay, as long as if you were to delete this information, everything else would be okay. The SAT instructor is nice, and that does fit if you were to delete that information in the middle there. So that's the long intro versus the middle modifier. They're both right in their own situations, and you're rarely ever asked to choose between them. Here, very complicated. We have her 2014 novel, Boy Snow Bird, for instance. So now this is a middle modifier, not related to what we were just talking about, but just a little timeout in the sentence that further complicates things. But the correct usage in this sentence is a long intro. This is her 2014 novel, Boy Snow Bird. So this is a long intro, just like the long intro right here with no commas. Now, I know you see commas there, but bear with me, it kind of has no commas. So just like we say SAT instructor Alex Torres, here we're saying her 2014 novel, Boy Snow Bird. Now, the commas that you're seeing are not real commas in the sense that we're talking about. Those commas belong to the actual title of the novel. So they're not part of our decision of whether or not there should be a comma here. It's just her 2014 novel, whatever the name is. So that we're going to consider a long intro. And it's really, really complicated. This is, yes, a long intro question, but it's got some real built-in curveballs to it. But when we get over here to the other part, we're talking about her 2014 novel Gingerbread offers a delicious twist on the classic tale of Hansel and Gretel. In other words, because we've defined the first one as a long intro with no commas, even though there are those other commas that we don't want to talk about, but it's really the idea of having no commas, then we're going to go ahead and go with this. Her 2019 novel Gingerbread offers a delicious twist. And so what we're saying is that because we had a long intro here, we want another long intro here so they all match up. And the answer here is C. Going over to question 20 now. This is our standard grammar prompt on the SAT. When you see this phrasing, you know you have a grammar question. And let's start reading. The violins, handmade in the 17th century by this craftsman, have been celebrated as some of the finest in the world. In close collaboration with musicians, this person introduced changes to the shape of a traditional violin, flattening some of the instrument's curves and making it lighter overall. So why did I say it so easily here? Because I'm paying attention to what it is we're naming. It was flattening some of the instrument's curves and making the instrument lighter overall. So if you know what it is that you're referring to, it's very easy to pick the pronoun for it. Instrument is singular. Singular things get a singular pronoun. This is plural. This is plural. One is a kind of a special use. Like sometimes, if you're being really philosophical, you might say, when one is doing this, one must always consider that. So kind of throwing the word one in there is kind of a throwback to that idea, which doesn't really fit this situation. But if we're talking about an instrument, we'll just refer back to it with the word it. And so the answer here is D. Going to question 21 now. This is our standard grammar prompt. When you see this, you know it's a grammar question. And let's start reading. During the English neoclassical period, many writers imitated the poetry and satires of these people. They were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical antiquity, however. Some of the most prominent figures of the earlier Renaissance period were also influenced by these guys. So, a lot going on, but this is a classic situation that comes up a lot on SAT questions. Let's take it apart. First of all, let's talk about when we should use a semicolon. Here are our rules for semicolon, colon, and long dash. But right now, let's just talk about the semicolon. It's for two independent clauses. John went to the mall. He bought shoes. So coming back over this question, they were not the first in England to adopt the literary modes of classical antiquity, however. So that is an independent clause. And the word however is kind of thrown in there as a modifier. Again, like we talk about on a lot of questions, a modifier is just like a little extra bit of information kind of tacked on at some point in a sentence. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But let's talk about how the next part is also an independent clause. Some of the most prominent figures of the earlier Renaissance period were also influenced by Greek and Roman literature. So that also could have been a sentence. So the semicolon is a good thing here. Now, by the way, when you have two independent clauses with just a comma between, because this is a modifier, we're kind of pretending it's not there. And if it were sort of temporarily deleted, then you would have an independent clause on this side of the sentence and followed by an independent clause on that side of the sentence. When you have two independent clauses basically separated with a comma, like you do in answer choice B, that's what's called a comma splice. Two independent clauses should be separated by a semicolon or a comma fanboys. Separating them just with a comma is called a comma splice. Separating them just with a fanboys word like and is called a fuse sentence. And separating them with nothing at all is called a run-on. So that is an important mistake that you'll be hearing a lot of on different grammar questions. But coming back over here, we have our two independent clauses. Like I mentioned, two independent clauses can be joined with semicolons or comma fanboys. So comma and is a popular thing. But this situation with the however type of word, either going before or after the semicolon, that's a really important situation. If it's coming after the semicolon, it's basically saying that the orange part of the sentence is a contrast to the pink part of the sentence. And that would ruin the logic of what's being said. They weren't the first. If we follow that with, however, other people were also influenced, that's saying that those two things are contrasting each other, and they're not. It's more of like a colon situation. They weren't the first. And then when we say some of the most prominent figures were influenced, we're explaining how they weren't the first. So it's really important to say that the pink and orange parts of the sentence agree with one another. Now, putting the however on the left side of the semicolon has an entirely different function. It's telling us that the pink part of the sentence is contrasting the purple previous sentence. So, during this period, writers imitated the poetry of ancient Greece and Rome. However, they were not the first to adopt those literary modes. So there is a contrast there. Many people did it, but they weren't the first ones to do it. And then in orange, it explains in an earlier period, other people did it as well. So that, however, being placed before and not after the semicolon, that's a very, very important SAT moment that you should pay extra attention to. And it comes up very frequently. Going to question 22, let's start with the prompt. And here the prompt is asking us for a transition word. Now for transition words, you want to invent your own word before looking at the answer choices. That forces you to actually understand what you're reading. So let's start reading. One poll taken after the first presidential debate suggested that Kennedy lost badly. Only 21% of those who listened on the radio rated him the winner. The debate was ultimately considered a victory for the young senator who rated higher than his opponent, Nixon, among those watching on the new medium of television. So we're seeing a clear contrast. We really need a however here, because what's being said is that it seemed like Kennedy lost badly. And they gave data about why. Only 21% of radio listeners thought he was the winner. However, this was ultimately a victory for Kennedy because he rated higher than his opponent on TV. So although he lost on radio, however, he won on TV. So we're looking for a contrasting word. And In other words, is like a restatement. Therefore, cause and effect, which we're not looking for. Likewise is repetition. But nevertheless, that is a contrasting word similar to however. And so the answer here is D. Going to question 23 now. Here we're being asked for a transition. And for transition words, you want to invent your own word before looking at the answer choices. So let's start reading. In this date, this person was living in what must have seemed like the ideal city for young artists, Paris. She was studying firsthand the color style of the modernist masters and beginning to make a name for herself as a painter. But she longed to return to her childhood home of India. Only there, she believed, could her art truly flourish. So she was living what must have seemed like the ideal, living in what must have seemed like the ideal city for an artist. She was studying firsthand and she was making a name for herself, but she longed to return to her home. Only there she thought her art would flourish. So definitely a very big contrast. Therefore is cause and effect. Indeed is kind of agreement. If we're going further with an idea we already stated, we would say indeed. And furthermore is like in addition. Furthermore, moreover, those mean in addition. So still is a surprising contrast word. This was the case, but still that other thing was the case. So the answer here is A. Going to 24 now. Let's start with the prompt like always. And here we're being told that we're looking for a transition word. So let's start reading. In his book, this geographer challenged prevailing views about how natural landscapes influence human cultures. He argued that instead of being shaped entirely by their natural surroundings, cultures play an active role in their own development by virtue of their interactions with the environment. So he challenged prevailing views, and I might say specifically, because now they're getting into the specifics of exactly what this person argued. And of course, specifically is the word there. I did answer that in my own words first, but sometimes what you say in your own words ends up being exactly the right thing. Now, similarly is for repetition, which we're not seeing here. Finally is a conclusion. This is a really short thing, so it'd be a little surprising to hear a conclusion there. And therefore is cause and effect. The second thing wasn't caused by the first thing. The second thing was a further explanation of the first thing. So specifically is perfect. Now going to question 25, let's start with the prompt like always. And the prompt is asking us for the most logical transition. And for transition words, you want to invent your own word before looking at the answer choices. That forces you to truly understand what you're reading. So let's start reading. Although those who migrated to California in this year dreamed of finding gold nuggets in stream beds, the state's richest deposits were buried deeply in rock beyond the reach of individual prospectors. By 1852, many had given up their fortune hunting dreams and gone to work for one of the large companies capable of managing California's complex mining operations. So we see a contrast in the beginning. Although people had these dreams, it actually turned out that the richest deposits were really only accessible by the big companies. They were beyond the reach of individual prospectors. So, in my own words, I guess I'd say so. By 1852, many had given up their dreams and gone to work for one of those large companies. So, what we're seeing is a cause and effect. It turned out it wasn't so easy to get the gold, so many people gave up on their dreams. And which of these words that was given to us is a cause and effect? Furthermore is like a moreover, which means in addition. Still is a contrasting word like however. Consequently is cause and effect. The second thing happens as a consequence of the first thing. And next is just simply chronology. This thing happened next. And that's kind of true here. But it's definitely not as good as consequently, because the second thing was really the result of the first thing. It wasn't just what happened next. So the answer here is C. Now going to question 26. This question type with the bullet points, these are called rhetorical synthesis questions. And for these, You first want to find out what you're supposed to be looking for in the prompt. If by any chance there's more than one answer choice that fits that description of what we're looking for, then we refer to the data to find out which of the answer choices is better. And surprisingly, we often don't even have to go to the data. So let's test that out here. So we are wanting to present this study and its conclusions so we can get rid of any answer choices that are not both presenting the study and its conclusions. So looking at A, as part of a 2013 study of cat domestication, a chemical analysis was conducted on cat bone fragments found in this place in China. No conclusions. We don't hear anything here about what was determined. They found that cat domestication does something. We didn't hear anything like that. Looking at B, a 2013 analysis of cat bone fragments found in this place in China suggests that there may have been domestication 5,300 years ago. So we are seeing a presentation of the study and the results, what the study suggests. So we'll definitely keep that one for later. C, in 2013, archaeologists studied what cats had eaten more than 5,000 years ago. Once again, no conclusion, just like A. We're not finding out what the results were of the study. And D, cat bone fragments estimated to be 5,300 years old were found in China in 2003. We're not seeing the conclusion there either. We're also not getting any presentation of the study. We're just hearing that this is what was found, but we're not hearing a study was done and, giving us background information about the study. So no presentation of the study, so we can easily get rid of that. And here, notice that we didn't have to look at this information. On harder rhetorical synthesis questions, you do have to look at that info, but this one was nice and easy. So the answer here is B. Now going to question 27. This setup with the bullet points at the top, these are called rhetorical synthesis questions. And for these questions, you first want to find out what you're supposed to be looking for. And if there are multiple choices that fit that description, then you use the bullet points to differentiate between them. And so here, what is it we're supposed to be doing? The student wants to emphasize a difference in the origin of the two words. So we're looking for something that's doing that. Let's start looking at the answer choices. A says, this, the final word of the National Spelling Bee, is of Anglo-French origin, while the following year's final word, this one, derives from ancient Greek. Well, definitely emphasizing a difference in the origins of the two words. So that looks very good. B says, in 2008, this person won the National Spelling Bee by correctly spelling this word. However, the following year, this person won based on spelling the other word. So we're seeing the two words in there, but no mention of the origins or the difference between them. C, this person won the spelling bee by correctly spelling this word, which derives from this. So here we're not even hearing about two words. So definitely not the difference in the origin of the words. And D, the Scripps National Spelling Bee uses words from diverse linguistic origins, such as this one and this one. So, once again, we hear that there are different origins, but we're not hearing what the origins are. So, no emphasis of the difference between those origins. So, this is one of the lucky ones where we didn't really have to look at the bullet points here, and we can easily see that the answer is A. Join today to take your SAT prep to the next level. Members get access to over 1,000 solution videos answering the questions in College Board's question bank and concept-based practice questions with videos to solidify your SAT skills. Thanks for watching. Grateful.